So this week's Torah portion. This week's Torah portion is the Torah portion where we are told once more the story of Korach, the rebellion of Korach. Now there's been a lot of murmurings, there's been a lot of complainings, there's been a lot of little rebellions. But nothing like this one. Nothing like the rebellion of Korach and his followers. Korach is standing up and challenging the authority and the system of rule that Moses and Aaron put in place in order to govern, support, guide the wandering tribes of the Israelites on their 40-year journey. And Korach feels it is anything but democratic, and he wants to change who is at the head. And it's a unique rebellion. It's a real deal this time, because the people who support Korach, 250 men, the Torah is telling us, are leaders of the tribes, men of renown, chiefs among the families. And Korach himself is of the tribe of the Levite, the same family that both Aaron and Moses come from. So this is serious business. However, it doesn't end well for Korach and his followers. Moses challenges him back and says, let God decide between us who should be leading the Israelites through the desert. And there's a big showdown, you come at high noon the next day and Moses is standing right in front of Korach. And they're going to go for it. And they're going to say this incantation. It's almost magic happening. And we'll see who God chooses to support. And God shows up and obviously sides with Moses and against Korach. Korach and all his minions are decimated. The earth opens up and swallows them all. And so what you see because of that story is thousands of years of rabbinic commentaries trying to justify and explain exactly what happened. I mean, you can't blame the rabbis because here's the story and they have to do something with it. They have to take from it the essential teachings. And so they're not going to go against the story. They're not going to go against God smiting everybody. They're going to try to tell us why that happened and how wrong Korach was and how right Moses was, and thousands of years of that. And you can't blame them either. I mean, this story is written, 2,500 years ago, give or take, a few hundred years. And at the time, you're really hard-pressed to come up with a story where those who are revolting are going to win against a divinely ordained leader. I mean, you live in society where the leaders under which you work as a scribe are proclaiming to be divinely ordained, and to write a story that says we should topple them is not going to work. At best, it's a career-limiting move. At worst, it's a life-ending decision. So you can imagine that those who wrote the stories were somewhat compelled to write it the way they did. And in fact, really, no kings through any time in history would have allowed any such narrative to be published under any kind of circumstances. up until really the American and French Revolution, where that becomes actually the thing to do. And where some other people's heads begin to be chopped off. But to me, there is something powerful about having that story still included. Because those who wrote the stories knew that down the line, we were going to argue over who was right and who was wrong. They knew that some of us would say, sometimes Moses was right, but let's take a look at Korach, maybe he was right. So they took the risk, really, to put that story in there. They put the risk of having one of us, any of us, rabbis, come up with Moses was wrong, and we should have followed Korach. And the reason I appreciate the story being there, because they could have just simply deleted it. We would have never known. There are many, many other stories of revolt and rebellions. We didn't need one more. Every 3 pages there is a murmur or something against Moses, and we are complaining about this or that or the other. Yet they decided to keep it there. And because I believe that Torah is the quintessential book on spirituality, I also believe that there is a deep spiritual teaching in that. And I invite you to discover it with me. Because the truth of the matter is, I'm in a place in my life today where I have come to really connect and sympathize with the rebelliousness that Korach symbolizes. So let's think about it. What do we have here? We have Moses ahead of a system of rule that he has imposed on the people in order to organize them so that they might travel through the wilderness for 8 years in some kind of shape or form to achieve the ultimate goal, that is to enter the promised land. And just like Moses organized and promoted this system of rules, so do we live in such system of rule. The system in which we live is most of the time a system that serves us beautifully. It helps us be more or less a united nation. It helps us live our day-to-day life without risking our life. We can live in security, we can live in peace with each other within the borders of the United States of America most of the time. It also gives us a purpose in life. This system tells us what is it we need to be dreaming of, or what goals we need to set. So it gives us some kind of a pathway to follow. So most of the time, overwhelmingly, this system in which we live is a force of good in our life. But as everything, and as we've learned, the greater the light, the greater the shadow. And our system is fraught with deep, dark shadow. And the reason for that, I figure, is that at the core of any system is the need, the wanting of self-perpetuation. Systems are completely adverse to change in any shape or form. And, not to forget, the systems are put in place to serve those who create them in the first place. And that's a very important notion to remember. Any kind of system is there to serve the people who put the system in place in the initial setting. Right? Those systems often are based on fear and conflict, sometimes real conflict, sometimes manufactured conflict, in order to have some kind of self-preservation, self-continuation. They are based on division. Divided in order to conquer is part of this kind of systems. They are based really in a way that is there to unite those who benefit the most from the system in order for them to defend it. And that causes great friction. That causes great pain for those who are not part of that founding group of people. And we have been reminded this week again. We have been reminded this week again that the system in which we live is fundamentally, has as its foundation a deeply racist culture. A deeply racist culture. And I think this is critical for us to hold in consciousness. Because we have already heard, and we will hear again in the days to come, that the action that we witnessed in Charleston, South Carolina, the massacre at the Black church, that historic church in Charleston, is due to this crazy guy that is on the fringes of everything, that is really not part of society, that has probably some kind of mental illness, who wasn't really completely all together. We're going to hear those messages over and over and over again. And I don't think so. I think that white man, that white child, that white man is the product of the system in which he grew up. The system in which we live. He may be an extreme example of that, but that consciousness, that worldview, that way of understanding and visualizing society is unfortunately part and parcel of the tapestry of this system in which you and me, function day in and day out. The white majority, that same white majority that set up the system in the first place, is seeing that it is about to become the next minority in our country. And we are afraid. Perhaps we are afraid because we know what happens to minorities. But we are afraid. And that fear forces us to raise up walls, to move farther and farther into more and more radically conservative ways of being, to draw more and more lines of division between us. May they be political, obviously, social, cultural, I would even say geographical, absolutely economical, and as we've seen this week, racial. And it is a system that is going to become more and more violent because of that fear. But that's not the only shadow we have in this system. The other shadow, we were witnessing it just last week as well. Saw the Shell oil rig being gently pulled out of the port of Seattle, floating away as a beautiful flower. And that is another shadow of our system, because in its very foundation, the system in which we live has absolute disrespect. Well, maybe not absolute, but it's really hard to find words when such things are in our backyard. But it's based on greed and the plundering of the earth for profit, with disregard for not only the voice of democracy, which we have to be very careful of, but also and obviously disregard for the sustainability of our planet as a livable habitat. And that is a major shadow in our system. So I suspect that Korach is there in the Torah. Whether he won or didn't win is of no consequence. Korach is there in the Torah, and that's what matters, because he's there to tell us that systems of rule that are not challenged are extremely dangerous. Extremely dangerous. I just came back from this trip in Central Europe, in Czech Republic and Poland. And me and other people in our group, we witnessed firsthand how systems can be deadly. We walked through the concentration camps, we walked through the extermination camps, and we saw with our own eyes how a systematic, and I can't put enough weight on that word, how systematic the Nazi plan was. It wasn't murder out of rage. It wasn't butchering out of excitement. It was meticulous. It was planned. It was executed with great precision. It was built into a system that was put in place to eradicate entire populations. And I'm not only talking about the Jews, but there are really no more Jews in Poland, in the Czech Republic, in Hungary. We're gone. And the few thousands here and there that remain, with 3+ million that were there, is just a shock to the system. But it was not only the Jews. Entire populations were decimated in a way that was absolutely calculated and systematic. All the way to the end of the railway, in the camps themselves, where the soldiers, the Nazi soldiers in the camp, were encouraged to perfect the killing of people, to make the system ever more efficient, ever more profitable as well. So I came back from that with great wariness when it comes to any kind of systems. It awoke within me the voice of Korach. And the voice of Korach is a voice that is needed. And we've had some Korach throughout history. If we just go back to these biblical times, the end of biblical times, at the time of the Second Temple, we have a group of rabbis who, in their own way, revolt in peaceful, non-violent ways, revolt against the system in place, a system that is completely corrupt. Both the priesthood and the kingship in Israel are completely corrupt, and there is great oppression at the hand of the Romans. And though some rabbis will take arms and literally revolt against the Romans, others will take books and imagine, invent, dream up a different kind of Judaism, the Judaism we've come to practice today. Another Korach of his time, of the same time, was Jesus. Another non-violent, peaceful Korach who stood in the same way against the corruption of the priests of the temple and the kingship, and against the oppression of the Romans. Two different directions that Judaism took. One eventually became named and called Christianity, but those moments, people showed up. The Korach within was awakened. Closer to us, we are reminded of Martin Luther King, another deeply spiritual leader who with fierce love and compassion, stood in the way of oppression and racism. Mahatma Gandhi also comes to mind. Same beautiful spiritual leader who lifted up a whole nation in revolt. And then yesterday, and I'm excited, yesterday a new Korach stepped up to the global platform. The Pope. The Pope came out and said, we have to start a revolution, a new rebellion against this system, this economy that is destroying its people, that is swallowing its people, that is destroying the planet. We are called by this Korach to rebel. And frankly, it feels to me that we have to heed this call. That we have to rebel in peaceful, fiercely loving, non-violent ways against this oppressive system. And we can't let the fact that we as white people who benefit the most from it, let ourselves be lulled into complacency. We can't afford that. Literally, we can't afford that. I'm not even talking about minorities who clearly cannot afford that, but we can't afford that because we are participating in our own self-destruction. Of course, it's not visible today, so we can't see it. It's going to happen to our children. So we are just as much confronted by this dark shadow of the system we are part of as anybody else is. Perhaps that's why there are so many Jews in history that have been revolutionaries, that have revolted against any form of system. Perhaps we are called to be permanent revolutionaries. Perhaps this is part of who we need to be. And it can start today, tomorrow, in our own lives, to refuse to participate in the violence that is being displayed on our TV screens through our sports, to stand up to the discrimination against gender and sexual differences. Because let's not forget that those white people who set up the system were white men. And gender discrimination is a plague that is still part of the tapestry of this system. We, in our own ways, can become our own Korach. And this is perhaps the call that this week's Torah portion is calling us to, as it happens exactly in such a time of turmoil in our nation, such a time of violence. If we ever going to have a chance to bring shalom into our nation, into our world, we are going to have to activate the voice of Korach with it. Nasim shalom tova uvracha. In such a way that we will bring forth blessings of goodness, blessings of peace. We will be a force for greater justice